Welcome to the third dimension. Yemen's war stretches into its 9th year, and while there is a relative calm in hostilities at this current time, the war has destroyed the country and caused the Yemeni people massive suffering. The warring parties have committed atrocious acts that could constitute war crimes. These abuses have resulted in Yemen being named the worst humanitarian crisis ever. The Houthis have planted mines randomly without differentiating between military or civilian sites. Also, crimes committed against women are particularly grave, amounting to murder, maiming, detention, kidnapping, and sexual violence. Often called the Forgotten War, Yemen seems to have been left behind the global community, and its people have paid the price. To discuss this topic, join me, Kresteen Biekerley. Kresteen is a clinical lecturer in law at Yale School of Law, the United States. Her work focuses on international humanitarian law violations and international human rights abuses during conflict. Welcome to the third dimension, Kresteen.
For having me.
Kresteen, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. If I may start asking you now, Kresteen, 9 years of conflict in Yemen, and Yemen remains the forgotten war in the Western agenda. The Russian invasion has even diverted the attention from Yemen. In your point of view, how has the focus on Ukraine hurt the Yemen's crisis?
Thanks so much for having me and for that question. I think it's interesting because in some ways, I think the focus on Ukraine has diverted attention away from Yemen. In other ways, I think what we're seeing in terms of developments, particularly on questions related to international justice, accountability, and what are owed to civilians that are harmed during war, how those conversations have been playing out in Ukraine, gives me some hope that we can push the West, that we can push powerful states, that so far how they've responded to the conflict in Yemen is completely insufficient and not enough. So a basic way of putting that is, if you look at all of the international infrastructure that exists for states, for people, for powerful entities to respond to war and conflict, you've really seen all the stops pulled out for Ukraine. So you had a UN investigation created for Ukraine. At the same time, you had the UN investigation for Yemen closed. So that's one very obvious difference. You've also had these states use all of these different places in the international legal infrastructure, for example, the International Court of Justice, the UN General Assembly, to push the notion of the fact that if there's a war and international law violations happen during war, there needs to be some form of accountability, be that prosecutions of individual perpetrators or reparations to victims. So you have all of this happening on Ukraine at the same time as the conversation on justice for Yemen has really fallen flat. And you've seen the people or the states that were previously pushing for justice for Yemen not doing so as strongly as they might have done 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I think what activists are trying to do now in Yemen, in the region and beyond, is say, okay, we're seeing all the things you're doing for Ukraine, and that's great. You should respond to the conflict in Ukraine. But do Yemenis deserve any less? No, they deserve the same. They should have the same human rights as any person in Ukraine. And so look at what you're doing in Ukraine and think about what you should be doing and can be doing for people in Yemen.
Okay. Now, Kresteen, we keep hearing about international humanitarian law and international human rights. Now, as by the position of your specialization, how do we make differentiation between both concepts, and are they both apply to the Yemeni situation?
It's a very good question. So the easiest way to explain it is that international humanitarian law is the set of international rules that apply during armed conflict. So there's no question that what's happening right now in Yemen is an armed conflict. It's a war. So international humanitarian law applies to what anybody does in Yemen, particularly the warring parties. So that means the warring states, be that the Yemeni government, Iran, Saudi, the United Arab Emirates, as well as non-state armed groups, with kind of the one that people know, the Ansar Allah Houthi armed group. So for all of these actors, international humanitarian law applies to what they do. And it's probably no surprise to anybody who's been following Yemen, living in Yemen, watching what's been happening in Yemen, to know that all of these actors have been violating international humanitarian law repeatedly and consistently over the last many years. International human rights law is important, though, because international human rights law is the set of international rules that say that individual people get rights. So any person has a set of internationally recognized human rights, and when those rights are violated, they have the right to a remedy, or they have the right to a response to that violation. And international human rights law applies at all times. So it doesn't matter if it's peace, it doesn't matter if it's conflict, international human rights law applies. And so that also applies in Yemen. And that means that when we look at what needs to happen in response to international law violations, we can't just be thinking about what do the warring parties want, what do states want. We actually have to be thinking about what do individuals deserve, what rights do they have, and what obligations do warring parties thus have to those people whose rights they've violated.
Okay. Now, Kристin, in your recent report, which is entitled The Case for Reparations to the Victims of Yemen's War, you say in that report that Russia's invasion of Ukraine prompted what we called significant international movement on reparations. If I may ask you, what do we mean by reparations, and why reparations are so important for Yemen, and more importantly, who should be providing these reparations?
So first of all, thank you for the very excellent questions. And let me try to answer this briefly. So the reason I say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine prompted significant international movement on reparations is that usually when we think about justice or international accountability, often what people are talking about is prosecutions of individuals that committed, for example, war crimes, and punishment of those individuals. So we're thinking about trials and courts. We might be thinking about the International Criminal Court, or courts within various states, kind of going after the people who committed international crimes and punishing them. And that's a hugely important part of justice. But reparations is kind of the other hugely important part of justice, which is to say that when we're talking about accountability, yes, we have to think about the perpetrators, the people who did the wrong things, but we also have to think about the victims of the illegal acts. We have to think about the people who were harmed by these violations. And what reparations are is the right of someone, of a victim, to either compensation, so money, an apology, for example, an acknowledgement of what happened to them, rehabilitation, for example, healthcare, education in response to the wrong that was done to them, as well as things like guarantees of non-recurrence, which means basically that the actor that did the wrong thing has to put in place policies and procedures to show that they're not going to do that thing again. And so for me, the reason that reparations is so important is that justice is both about punishing the people and the actors and the states and the non-state armed groups that do unlawful acts, but it's also about saying, and there are all of these victims who have been harmed, who are bearing the costs of these international law violations, and the international community has to do something to recenter them in the justice conversation. And in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what happened was you had all of this action on prosecution and punishment. And you also had all of these states say, you know what, we also want reparations for the state of Ukraine and individual Ukrainians. So people who were harmed during this war, they deserve some form of reparations. They deserve some form of assistance, basically, in response to the harms that they suffered. So that's not always the case. Often you just talk about accountability from the perspective of prosecutions and punishment. But for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, now we're saying, no, actually, there's these two pieces of accountability, prosecutions and punishment and reparations. Why is this also important for Yemen? basically because look at Yemen, look at all of the people that have been bearing the cost of this war for now, honestly, nearly a decade, right? And I think I could keep talking about it in the international law sense, but it's easier to talk about in just the human sense, where you brought up the issue of Houthi landmines. So if I'm a person, and frankly, many of the people who have been harmed by Houthi landmines have been children and women, and I lose my leg because a landmine exploded,
Yeah.
who helps me? What happens after that? My whole life has been changed. I need medical care. I might need a prosthetic. And the notion of reparations is to say that that question, what happens to that person, is a question for the international community. It is a question of justice and accountability. And the way we should be thinking about that person is not just, let's get them humanitarian aid. The way we should be thinking about that person is they have a right, and the Houthis have an obligation to provide them some form of reparation to help deal with the harm. Same goes for someone whose house gets destroyed in a Saudi UAE-led coalition airstrike. Maybe that person lived their whole lives in that house, and now they don't have a home, they can't afford rent. And so what obligations do the Saudis and the Emiratis have to that person? And the question isn't just they should give them humanitarian aid. The question is, did they violate international law? And if so, that person has a right to reparation. That person has a right to the actor that did the wrong to sort of try and respond to the harms that flowed from that wrong.
Yes. Okay. Just a week ago, Christine, I was interviewing one of the member of the UN panel of experts. He was in Yemen. Okay. And we talked about this kind of panel of experts being what we call an investigating body. But of course, we know that the mandate was terminated. Now, the question was that that kind of committee had also difficulties in access. How would you, my question is, how would you assess such abuses and which parties are committing them? All these questions, Christina, how do you put them in context for any investigating body to work in Yemen?
Yeah, so I think we can think about the UN group of eminent experts in a couple of ways. The first way you can think about it is it's really important to have documentation and investigations of what's going on. The other way you can think about it goes back to the question you asked me at the start of this interview, which is, why has the West, why have different states kind of paid less attention to Yemen over the last couple of years? And I think one of the things that the UN group of eminent experts did was that it meant that every year in Geneva, states at the UN Human Rights Council had to sit and they had to listen to a report about violations in Yemen. And that matters because it meant that every year on the agenda, you had a body that was created by the United Nations, that was funded by the United Nations, saying, hey, listen, Yemen is important. And hey, listen, violations that are happening to people in Yemen are important. And you all need to figure out something to do to respond to it. And so part of the reason I feel quite sad, frankly, that the UN Human Rights Council got rid of the UN group of eminent experts is because we lost this body that gave us a moment upon which we could sort of point to the West and we could point to other governments and say, well, what are you doing in response to the conflict in Yemen? Because the violations are continuing and we still don't have accountability. In response to your specific question about what do you do when that body doesn't have access, how do you actually document all of the many, many, many violations that have happened in Yemen, and how do you ensure that that documentation then ends up being used for credible accountability, including prosecutions and reparations? That's a very big question. And I think one of the things that I feel pleased about is that there's a whole array of Yemeni civil society actors, activists, lawyers, who have been spending the entirety of this conflict figuring out questions related to documentation. So you have people all over Yemen that have been spending, frankly, their lives and putting themselves at great risk doing documentation of all sorts of violations by all sorts of different warring parties. And those people are in Yemen, right? They're doing documentation in Yemen. When you have an international body like the UN group of eminent experts do documentation too, they're often talking to, cooperating with, interacting with groups that are in Yemen and listening, learning, and frankly, really benefiting from the work that these people are doing. Ultimately, though, we're at a position where the actors that we need to get on board with justice and accountability are not interested in justice and accountability. So none of the warring parties in Yemen right now are advocates for justice and accountability. And so the question becomes, what powerful actors, what actors with influence do we need to sort of stand on the side of justice and accountability to ensure that all of that documentation is collected, analyzed, and eventually feeds into justice processes?
And excuse me, Christine, by actors, do you mean local actors or regional powers?
In response to which part?
Yeah, actors, you said they are not interested in having this kind of investigating body, for instance.
Both, I would say. So, for example, in Geneva, the actors that specifically got rid of the UN investigation that pushed for it were the Saudis and the Emiratis.
Yes.
So at the international level, the Saudis and the Emiratis have really been pushing to block international accountability efforts. At the local level, though, the Houthis are also not interested in justice and accountability. Neither is the Southern Transitional Council. So I think at both the local and the regional level, you have the main warring parties. They're fighting on everything else, but the one thing that they agree on is that they don't want to be held accountable for the wrongs that they have committed against Yemeni civilians.
So in this case, Yemenis would continue to suffer, Christine.
Yes and no, because I think that, yes, it is absolutely true that the warring parties and the people that, for example, are represented at peace negotiations, either through the UN or in the back channel negotiations, are not interested in justice and accountability. But that's not all of Yemen. That's only this tiny part of Yemeni society. Yeah. And there's such a huge part of Yemeni society that's working to fight against that. So you have activists all over the country who are both working with one another, that they are documenting violations, they're working with victims groups, they're trying to talk to people outside of Yemen to say, listen to us, don't let these warring parties that have frankly destroyed and decimated this country for 10 years, be local or regional, decide our future, listen to us, give us a seat at the table, let us have a say in what happens next. And those actors are all pushing justice and accountability. So I think what happens next really is whether those with influence outside Yemen, regionally and inside Yemen, start listening to the people who are pushing for peace and justice rather than just saying, let's let the warring parties decide.
Yes. Okay. Now, if I come back again to the same report, Christina, and forgive me, in the opening of your report, you presented a case of mine victims. Okay?
Yeah.
And we all know that the Houthis have planted mines randomly without differentiating between military or civilian sites. Now, how do you comment on this, Christine, and specifically in terms of the international community putting pressure on the Houthis to hand over what we call maps of landmines, etc.?
Yeah. So I'm glad that you're asking about landmines because it's an issue that I care very much about. And one of my first investigations while I was still with Human Rights Watch was on the Houthi use of landmines in and around Taiz. And one of my last investigations with Human Rights Watch was after a trip to Aden, where we spent a good amount of time in some of the hospitals talking to landmines victims from mostly the Western Coast, actually, in and around Hudaydah. And I think what's, for lack of a better word, frustrating, is that landmines is an issue that has plagued Yemen from before this war, but actually Yemen had made all of this progress on landmines before this conflict. And then it's not just gone back, but it's become this huge plague and blight for Yemeni civilians, including people who get displaced, who want to go home. And so I think the international community has a couple of roles to play. A really obvious one that I think the international community, frankly, is already thinking about is providing aid and funding to assist with demining efforts, but also that aid and funding should go to victims of mine use. So that's something, there's already a conversation about it. It's obviously not enough. There needs to be more. But the second piece of it, which is harder, which I'm so glad you asked about, is that landmines, and particularly the use of anti-personnel landmines, which we have seen in Yemen, violate all sorts of international rules. And so this shouldn't just be a question of give humanitarian aid to Yemen to deal with landmines. it should be a question of justice and accountability, in particular in relation to the fact that the Houthi armed group have been using landmines throughout this war. And so what I would love to see would be, for example, an international investigation that's looking at various violations by all the various warring parties, that takes the issue of landmines seriously, and that doesn't just say, okay, who laid the landmines, where did they lay the landmines, but say, who are the victims of the landmines? Can we map them out? Can we say who's been harmed? And can we say what type of services or justice or reparations that these people want? And then how can we go about setting up a mechanism that deals with this question, that deals not just with, hey, the Houthis laid them here, but say, and the Houthis owe these people this thing. And then the second part of reparations, which I think is part of the reason I talk all the time about it, is that for some sort of reparations, you really do want to be engaging with the wrongdoing actor, in this case, the Houthis, to figure out, okay, if the Houthis do have maps, we absolutely want those maps because that facilitates demining. But maybe, as we've seen in other conflict contexts, you might also say to the Houthis, not only do you need to turn in the maps, but you should actually be a part of doing the demining. You should be a part of undoing the wrong that you guys committed. And so I think for landmines is actually an excellent example of why reparations are so important in the context of Yemen, and we shouldn't neglect them.
Okay, so if we may move to another type of violation, Kristin, we all know that women usually bear the brunt of any conflict, and we keep hearing about recent Houthi repressive measures. In fact, some observers have gone to describe that or those measures as being what we call Talibanization of the northern Yemen. Okay? So how do you comment on such repressive measures by Houthis on women, Kristin?
One of the things that I have found most hope-inducing during this conflict has been the role of Yemeni women in pushing back against all of the awful things that have happened to them. So there are many, frankly, amazing Yemeni activists and women and advocates and just people in their communities that I have watched over the last years kind of take on this really important role in responding to harms, in providing humanitarian aid. And so when I see a warring party like the Houthis, in this case, imposing egregious and frankly ridiculous restrictions on women, I find it maddening, not just because of all of the violations of international law and women's rights that we're talking about, but also because you have had this moment during the conflict where women have really stepped up and pushed to try and be pushing for peace and justice, and then to have a warring party try and restrict women in ways that don't make any sense. It's deeply demoralizing, to say the least. I think one thing that I really worry about, I will say, is that going back to the conversation earlier about sort of where political negotiations are happening and where decisions about Yemen's future are being made, I worry about what it says that we don't have an international investigation right now that's calling out these various kind of, again, crazy restrictions being imposed on women. You have had some UN experts write to the Houthis, but is that enough? Should we have some sort of body that's actually kind of continuously tasked with reporting on violations in Yemen, like the UN group of eminent experts was doing? And I say all of that because I'm really worried that the efforts by, for example, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Yemeni government to block international accountability efforts aren't just protecting themselves, they're also protecting the Houthis. And that's what I find kind of really frustrating, because you do need some sort of response to what the Houthis are doing. It's not okay, the restrictions they're imposing on women, and we see it getting worse and escalating. And then you have actors blocking the various international pathways that we might use to increase that international pressure, to increase condemnation. And so you end up in a situation where you're kind of asking the question, okay, Yemeni women are resisting this. Yemeni women are fighting against it. Yemeni civil society, Yemeni activists are fighting against it. Who's listening to them when they're calling for solidarity in that resistance?
Yeah, true. But again, don't you think, Kristin, in this point, before I move to the final point, don't you think that superpowers like the US, the United Kingdom, so they can exercise a kind of pressure on Houthis to stop such measures?
Well, I guess my question would be, is when we say pressure, what do we mean? So if we mean pressure in terms of creating some sort of international investigation to document and call out and call for justice and accountability in relation to violations of the Houthis and any other warring party, yeah, 100%. The United States, European Union, but also other states, like, for example, Latin American states or states in the global south, could take far more actions than they are currently taking in response to violations and abuses in Yemen. But the problem is, at the international level, be it at the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, is that the state of Yemen, the state of Saudi, and the state of UAE are saying, we actually don't want international accountability efforts because they're afraid that it will implicate them and it will show their own violations. And so absolutely, yes, there's so much more that the international community can and should be doing. Yes. But we're in this position where other warring actors, in particular the states that have a say at all of these UN fora, are blocking it because they're afraid of their own violations coming out.
Okay. Now, finally, Kristin, do you think accountability can find its way to Yemen again?
Absolutely, yes. So frankly, the most obvious way to get accountability on the international agenda would be the internationally recognized government of Yemen has a seat at all of these UN fora. All of these other states are listening to what the internationally recognized government of Yemen says. And putting aside sort of the obvious political landscapes and political weaknesses of the Yemeni government, formally speaking, legally speaking, it is still the internationally recognized government of Yemen that gets to go and say, you know what, we actually want the situation of Yemen to be before the International Criminal Court. You know what, we actually think that reparations are really important for Yemen. If you look at Ukraine, the state of Ukraine is yelling about justice and accountability every day. Yeah. And yet in the context of Yemen, the internationally recognized government of Yemen is not doing that. So the most obvious next step would be the internationally recognized government of Yemen saying, you know, we're actually going to listen to our people, we're going to listen to our citizens, and the one thing that we're going to take a stand on is say, like, we want justice and accountability for all victims. We all know the political reasons that that's not happening. Yeah. But again, you don't, even if the Yemeni government doesn't do that, or even if the Yemeni government does that in private but doesn't do that publicly, it is still possible for other states, again, yes, from the global north, but also from the global south, to support demands for justice in Yemen and to do a whole bunch of things that would actually move the ball on justice forward, including the ball on reparations. So states, for example, could fund civil society documentation of harms done to landmine victims, harms done to shelling victims, harms done to airstrike victims, so that we at least have the documentation and information we need should we get a reparations mechanism later. Yeah. States could also start exploring, you know what does a reparations mechanism look like for Yemen? What infrastructure do we need to actually ensure that all of the different warring parties are providing reparations? They've done that in other contexts, right? After Iraq invaded Kuwait, the UN Security Council set up a reparations mechanism. Yeah. After other wars, the states themselves set up reparations mechanisms. So it's not that it's impossible. Yeah. The question is just, will the people with influence and the people with power actually start listening to Yemeni civil society instead of saying, we want the warring parties to figure it out between themselves? Because again, there's this kind of failure, I think, in the international discussion of Yemen to be thinking about Yemen only in terms of the warring parties and not in terms of the other millions of people in Yemen who are going to continue living there and should have a say in the future of their country. Yeah.
Hopefully accountability can find its path to Yemen and Yemenis will have a release and a relief of this crisis. Thank you so much, Kristin, for your time and insights, and perhaps we can see you next time on Yemen Today TV. Thank you. That's all for this time. Thank you for watching. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.